representative democracy in Latin America. The United States has a strong interest in just the reverse, apart from formal elections that are often farcical, and that the alleged U.S. concern for democracy when proper conditions have been established by repression, violence, or simply control of resources, that is only a tactical device to ensure the dominance of, quote, private capitalistic enterprise linked to the United States. I'm quoting from that is only a tactical device to ensure the dominance of, quote, private capitalistic enterprise linked to the United States. I'm quoting from Gordon Connell Smith in the Major Study of the Inter-American System, published by the Royal Institute of International Affairs in London. As the leading U.S. academic scholar on human rights in Latin America has put it, the goal of the military authoritarian regimes sponsored by the United States has been to destroy permanently a perceived threat to the existing structure of socioeconomic privilege by eliminating the political participation of the numerical majority, principally the working or popular classes. That's what we call democracy. In the case of Nicaragua, as George Shultz frankly explained, the concern was that Sandinista success might embolden others to seek radical solutions to their problems unacceptable to the United States. Therefore, the United States followed what in fact is quite a traditional pattern, attempting to force Nicaragua into the Soviet orbit by military attack, pressures on allies and international lending institutions to refuse military and other aid, economic warfare that had had a lethal effect in a desperately poor country, ideological warfare here and abroad, including Nicaragua, where the U.S. in fact dominates the media in much of the country. The purpose was to abort the early successes of the Sandinista revolution in health, welfare, and development, and to ensure that the virus of independent development does not infect the region, to use the standard terms of, in this case, Henry Kissinger and others. There have been numerous other examples over the years. Now, policy does vary. So at the hawkish extreme, we have the Reaganites, who favor force over diplomacy and thunder that negotiations are a euphemism for capitulation if the shadow of power is not cast across the bargaining table, and that the purpose of our aid is to permit people who are fighting on our side to use more violence. That's George Shultz and Elliott Abrams, respectively. At the dovish extreme, we find Robert Pastor, who was Director of Latin American Affairs for the National Security Council under Carter. He explains that, quoting, "The United States did not want to control Nicaragua or other nations of the region, but it also did not want to allow developments to get out of control. It wanted Nicaraguans to act independently, except when doing so would affect U.S. interests adversely. Thus, Latin Americans should be free to choose as we wish them to choose." Again, what we call democracy. In practice, when they choose otherwise, we resort to what our friends in the Salvadoran military call the pedagogy of terror, sometimes in extreme forms, as under the Reagan administration, which is responsible for atrocities that merit comparison to Pol Pot. Turning briefly to the Middle East, the primary concern was the same: the fear that indigenous nationalism might threaten our effective control over one of the greatest material prizes in world history. That was understood since the 1940s to provide us with leverage over Europe and Japan. The National Security Council recognized in 1958 that, quoting, "a logical corollary of our opposition to radical nationalism would be support for Israel as a loyal ally." Now, this conception of Israel as a strategic asset became established in ways I can't review here, particularly under the Nixon Doctrine, with Israel and Iran under the Shah assigned the role of cops on the beat, as the Defense Secretary Melvin Laird put it at the time. Israel also increasingly came to provide services for U.S. power in Africa and Asia, but particularly in Latin America, as in Central America over the past decade, where Israel has served, in effect, as a mercenary state within the impressive international terror network that was partially exposed during the Iran-Contra hearings. These are the essential factors that have led the United States to block a political settlement to the Arab-Israeli conflict since 1971, a settlement that's backed by a broad international consensus that favors a two-state settlement on the internationally recognized borders, based on the principle that the indigenous population of the former Palestine and the Jewish settlers who largely displaced them both have the right of national self-determination. Now, such a settlement, which has long been feasible, is opposed by Khomeini, by Gaddafi, by the United States and Israel. U.S.-Israeli power has been decisive in blocking it. This policy, not too well understood here, but easily documented from the record, and traceable back to Henry Kissinger, that guarantees further escalation of the cycle of harsh repression, resistance, more repression and more resistance in the occupied territories, with the likelihood of regional wars and possible superpower confrontation, as has repeatedly threatened since 1967. Now, these are, I think, the main outlines of what you will discover if you review the ample documentary and historical record, a record that is very remote from official pieties, as we regularly discover in investigating international affairs and their ideological cover.
Thank you. And now our second opening statement from Mr. Richard Perle.
There is a story told, perhaps apocryphal, but perhaps true, about Machiavelli on his deathbed. A priest was summoned, leaned over to the ailing philosopher and said, "Are you prepared to reject the devil and embrace the Lord?" There was no response from Machiavelli, and so the priest repeated his question. Again, no response. He asked a third time, and this time Machiavelli raised his head slightly from the pillow and he said, "Father," he said, "this is no time to be making new enemies." And I don't want to make new enemies this evening, but I can't allow what I've just heard to stand unquestioned. So perhaps I might begin at the very beginning, with the notion implied by Professor Chomsky that there is a sense in which Soviet propaganda, which characterizes the United States and its allies as imperialist, is somehow mirrored, the mirror image, I think was his phrase, by what he calls American propaganda. I would hope that Professor Chomsky would acknowledge that there is at least one fundamental difference between propaganda in this country and propaganda in the Soviet Union, and that is that in the Soviet Union there is a monopoly disposed of by the state over what is said and written, what is presented over the air, for which there is no comparison in a society of multiple voices, one indeed that produces Professor Chomsky's books in large numbers, publishes his articles, and invites him to participate on the airwaves, as C-SPAN is now doing. Now, I listened with interest to Professor Chomsky's account of the State Department planners. I'm not quite sure who they are, with the exception of George Kennan, and I presume the references to Kennan were meant to include him in the group of State Department planners. State Department planners who, in Mr. Chomsky's view, planned in the post-war, immediate post-war period, for a grand area, an imperial American policy, in the Far East, he said, in Europe and in the Middle East. And yet, if we look at American policy in the post-war period, what was its principal thrust? Its principal thrust was the establishment of the Marshall Plan to help rebuild the economies of Europe, assistance to Japan to rebuild Japan along democratic lines, indeed the reconstruction of a Japanese constitution, and massive disarmament of American military forces. That is the foreign policy that Professor Chomsky would have you believe was designed to implement a vast imperial ambition. It would be among the most extraordinary miscalculations in the history of international politics to base an imperial policy on the reconstruction of other powers and the dismantlement of one's own military establishment. And yet that was the essence of American policy in the post-war period. Our policies, Professor Chomsky would have you believe, were intended to produce American control. But where do you see signs of American control in relation? It would be among the most extraordinary miscalculations in the history of international politics to base an imperial policy on the reconstruction of other powers and the dismantlement of one's own military establishment. And yet that was the essence of American policy in the post-war period. Our policies, Professor Chomsky would have you believe, were intended to produce American control. But where do you see signs of American control in relation, say, to our principal allies in the world? I had the privilege for more than 6 years of representing the United States, among other places, in meetings of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, an organization of 16 independent nations. And I can assure you that there wasn't a representative from any other nation around that table who would for a moment accept the notion that the United States controlled the policy of his country. When we deliberated, as we frequently did, in order to produce the statements that from time to time we made on a consensus basis, we had to persuade others to accept language that they could sign, and frequently, indeed most of the time, we were only able to achieve consensus by making essential compromises so that everyone was content with what became the policy of this collective organization. Hardly a system of control. Now, I haven't seen the State Department documents to which Professor Chomsky refers. And without questioning that such documents exist, I would only caution you as a practitioner who has worked inside the government not to trust too much on every piece of paper that's produced in the Department of State. I developed something of a reputation for disregarding all pieces of paper produced by the Department of State. And the fact is that the Department of State, like most other American institutions, contains a wide diversity of views and opinions, some of which one would wish to be associated with, others that one would most certainly not wish to be associated with. And I would take with a grain of salt the words of individuals just because they happen to constitute State Department documents. We are talking about the views of individuals frequently. Sometimes they may reflect policy and sometimes they may not. But this notion that one can go through the archives and on the basis of a document here and a document there, on the basis of plans and dreams that sounded to me in many cases quite fantastic, derive from that the essence of American policy, whether it is in Europe or the Far East or the Middle East or anywhere else, can only be the view of one who has never worked inside a governmental bureaucracy. Now, I find curious indeed the underlying thesis, and I take this to be the underlying thesis of Mr. Chomsky's presentation, that the United States somehow has an interest, that the United States and its citizens, or its elite, if he would care to put it that way, would somehow benefit from the destruction of democracy. It's a totally unproven assertion. It has been my impression over the years that the United States benefits most when it is able to exist in a world of some reasonable stability and prosperity. And democracy, as far as we know, is by far the most productive system in the history of mankind for the production of both stability and prosperity, and we would be fools to promote any other political doctrine anywhere else in the world. Now, this is not to say that we have not found ourselves from time to time in situations where our immediate interests happened to lay with a government in power that did not meet our standards of democracy. We live unfortunately in a world in which there are other countries, including some quite powerful countries, who do not believe that their interests lie with the expansion of democracy, but believe rather that their interests, and perhaps indeed their future, lies with the expansion of communist rule, in particular the sort of communist rule that might be directed or substantially influenced from the Soviet Union. And I wouldn't deny for a moment, I'd be foolish to deny it, and you would be foolish to fail to understand it, that there have been and will in future doubtless be occasions when the United States, in the interests of protecting its broad interests